Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming today. Thank you for being here for day 2. Drew and I just wanted to welcome you here to the museum as conveners of the second day of Exhibiting Africa. I just wanted to extend also a thank you to the entire Brooklyn Museum staff for your support, including Didem, Casca, Laurenzi, Junlee, Ernestine, Catherine, Sharon, and Anne, and especially Keith and AV. Thank you so much. And then, of course, to the entire Bard graduate team, thank you so much for helping and working together to create this really impactful moment. So if you were not able to catch day 1, we enjoyed 2 panels, Design and Display and Classical Contemporary, which engaged in understanding important and diverse ways of looking and experiencing art through spatiality and architecture, as well as negotiating the liminality between tradition-based, modern, and contemporary works in their display. Today we engage with ancient Africa, highlighting the ancient and medieval contexts that are much less represented in display. And this session will also explore display moments of temporal contexts that are underrepresented in contrast to other contemporaneous regions in antiquity. And we will also take a look at representation and consumption, our final panel, which provides critical frameworks for investigating the reception of African art and the diaspora in the West through specific overviews of collecting practices. So do you want to add anything, Drew? Okay, just checking. Now I'd like to introduce Catherine Footer, Director of Curatorial Affairs and Senior Curator of Decorative Arts, to welcome you to the museum as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Anissa, and good morning. And on behalf of Shelby White and Leon Levy, Director, and Pasternak, the Board of Trustees, and the staff of the Brooklyn Museum, it's my great pleasure and honor to welcome you to your second day of the Symposium Exhibiting Africa, the State of the Field in African Art and the Diaspora. I hope that the first day of the proceedings have been stimulating and that you reconnected with old friends and colleagues. I know I have, just briefly. I saw Sylvia come in, didn't get to say hello, but I also hope that you made new friends and colleagues. We're excited that you're all here at the museum to continue with this important work of engaging with the layered perspectives and approaches of presenting African and diasporic histories, lived realities, and creativity. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the director of the Bard Graduate Center, Susan Weber. Yay to Susan, also sponsoring Anissa. Associate Professor Drew Thompson, thank you, Drew. And of course, Anissa as the Bard Graduate Center Brooklyn Museum Postdoctoral Fellow for the Arts of African Collection. Yes, that's her title. For all their efforts to ensure that the 2-day proceedings are a great success. As the Brooklyn Museum reimagines its presentation of African art to national and international audiences in 2006 on the 3rd floor, so this floor, we hope that the feedback from this symposium will serve as fruitful content for this future endeavor that has been made possible through public as well as private funds. Ernestine and Anissa can tell you how I am personally thrilled that this important collection will be on view after years in storage. It's a wonderful opportunity to revisit, reinterpret, and reimagine these works for audiences. I hope that you have a great day today, and I will thank you and turn it over to Drew, right? Anissa, somebody. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. So now I will introduce the first speaker. But before I do that, I just wanted to go over some logistics, or the first session, excuse me. So we will go until 1 p.m., that will be our break, and then we will return at 2 p.m. for our second panel. So our break, you can go wherever you like. We have a cafe downstairs, but there's also places to eat around the museum as well. So I'm going to introduce our first discussant for our first panel, Geoff Emberling. He is a associate research scientist at the Kelsey Museum of Archaeology and lecturer in Mesopotamian and Nubian archaeology in the Department of Middle East Studies. He received his PhD in anthropology and Near Eastern Studies from the University of Michigan. And he's doing just amazing work in the Nile Valley, specifically in Sudan, and we're really excited to have him here. So let us please welcome Geoff to the stage.
Thanks, Anissa. Thanks, Drew. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Looking forward to our conversation today. This is not only a move from kind of contemporary art to ancient and medieval issues, but also a move very distinctly to the Nile Valley. And in that context, I want to make a plea, which I do to everyone, which is don't forget Sudan. Sudan is in the midst of a civil war which has completely disappeared from the international press. It's vicious, it's horrible, humanitarian crisis, both in Khartoum and in Darfur. In regular contact with my colleagues and the communities that we work with in Sudan, and relieved to say that outside the conflict zones, life is going on more or less as normal, but of course everyone's displaced and doesn't have work and doesn't have things to occupy them during the day. So don't forget Sudan. My second comment is that we discussants in this workshop have not been given very specific instructions about how we wish to run things. And my preference for this session is very definitely that we get as much engagement from you all as possible. So that's just a sort of a warning. Well, don't take it as a warning, really. But anyway, it's just a preview of the fact that I'm going to minimize my own lecturing time and give as much time as possible to questions and discussion. So keep that in mind. With that little bit of introduction, it's a pleasure to introduce Andrea Myers-Achi. Dr. Myers-Achi is trained as a Byzantinist, and her curatorial practice focuses on Byzantine art of the Mediterranean basin and Northeast Africa. In 2018, she earned a PhD in art history and archaeology from the Institute of Fine Arts of New York University. Currently, Dr. Achi is the Mary and Michael Jaharis Associate Curator of Byzantine Art in the Department of Medieval Art and the Cloisters at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. In her role, she specializes in the art and archaeology of late antiquity and Byzantium, with a particular interest in illuminated manuscripts and ceramics. She's brought this expertise to bear on exhibitions like Art and Peoples of the Karga Oasis of 2017, Crossroads, Power and Piety of 2020, and The Good Life of 2021 at the Met, and in numerous presentations and publications. Her next project at the Met opens in November 2023. That's very soon. and yet you're here with us. The exhibition, Africa and Byzantium, will showcase 190 works of art from Tunisia, Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia. Her exhibition will travel to the Cleveland Museum of Art in 2024. Dr. Achi will be speaking on African art in Byzantine exhibitions 1977 to now.
Good morning, everyone. And thank you so much for coming during the monsoon outside. I appreciate it. Okay. So Byzantine and African art are not usually used in the same sentence. Overall, as we know, these terms live within two very different curatorial and academic fields. However, my talk today will illuminate a little-known aspect of Byzantine studies. Almost every major exhibition of Byzantine art from 1977 to today has included African art. In my talk, I will review the consistent inclusion of Northern and Eastern African art in Byzantine exhibitions. I will also consider why this aspect of Byzantine curatorial practice is not widely known. I will end by looking forward and demonstrating how African art in Byzantine exhibitions continues to create a space to decenter established art historical narratives. First, I acknowledge that only some people are familiar with the history of Byzantium, and many might not even know what Byzantium is, so I will start with a refresher to orient the room. Northern Africa was an essential part of the Roman and Byzantine empires. In the Roman period, Northern Africa was the breadbasket of the empire. It was one of the wealthiest regions, with many production centers, and the region's artisans created high-quality products that were shipped worldwide. By the Byzantine period, the prominent status of North Africa remained. Northern African cities were the intellectual, cultural, religious, and artistic centers of Byzantium. And the regions below Byzantium, such as Nubia, Sudan, Aksum, Ethiopia, were the Byzantine Empire's close political allies and trade partners. So these connections have been highlighted and uplifted in Byzantine studies for years. For example, the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Age of Spirituality, which opened in 1977, had an entry map that included the early Byzantine Empire with important cities connected to the artworks in the exhibition. So on the map, it had African cities such as Carthage, Sousse, Alexandria, Abomina, and Akhmim, which is in Egypt. And due to its relatively dry climate, North Africa has some of the best preserved materials of the Byzantine world. In this exhibition, over 1/3 of the works were from Northern Africa. And on the screen, you can see Egyptian icons, Northern African metalwork, and textiles and sculpture. Then, in 1997, Helen Evans, the Byzantine curator at the Met before me, mounted the Glory of Byzantium. This exhibition was transformational to the study of Byzantine art in America. It brought many objects to the U.S. for the first time, and it included works from regions and communities beyond the center of the Byzantine Empire, such as Russia, Bulgaria, Georgia, and Armenia. But importantly for this talk, it also highlighted Byzantium's relationship with Northern Africa. And most importantly, the exhibition showcased Ethiopian art. In the exhibition catalog of Glory of Byzantium, the Black American Byzantinist Thelma K. Thomas wrote an essay that included Ethiopian and Nubian art. In the essay, she discussed Northern African motifs known in Byzantine and Byzantizing traditions. For example, she noted the compositional formats of Ethiopia's wide-ranging artistic repertoire and the reuse of early Christian Eusebian canon tables. She wrote about other direct connections to Byzantium between the northeastern African regions and the Byzantine world. So, for example, she described the Byzantine proxy wars in the Arabian Peninsula that happened in the late antique period, which made Byzantine and Aksumite empires strong, reliable allies. So a year after the exhibition, Helen Evans, and Elisa Lagama, the curator of African art, collaborated on an acquisition of an Ethiopian manuscript for the Met. It was an important endeavor, as the joint acquisition recognized Ethiopian art as medieval art and firmly grounded the manuscript in its African context. When Evans and Lagama presented the manuscript to Philippe de Montebello, the then director of the Met, he asked them why were they presenting this folk art to him. However, Evans and Lagama were ahead of their time, and the acquisition was the beginning of the discussion of medieval African art at the Met. In 2004, Byzantium Faith and Power, that 15th century Ethiopian manuscript was featured. The Byzantinist Annie Labat described the gospel and said Ethiopian painters adapted and transformed Byzantine sources to create a distinctive style characterized by vibrant color and bold graphic design. This manuscript has 24 full-page illustrations and has a wide range of cultural connections to early Christian art, but then also Byzantine, Syrian, Armenian, Coptic, and Islamic. The decorative borders of the manuscript show significant Islamic and Byzantine influences and reflect the strong connections between Ethiopia and Arabia. And on the scene are representations of the evangelist. In 2012, Byzantium Islam, Age of Transition, the exhibition welcomed millions of visitors to the Met and changed the field of art history I'm biased because I was in graduate school at that time. It brought important nuances to the discussions of interreligious exchange, influence, and appropriation between the 7th and 9th centuries. And the exhibition also included works of art mostly from North Africa and Egypt. All of these exhibitions were transformational to the study of Byzantine art and brought many objects to the United States for the first time. And innovatively, the exhibitions included works from the peripheries of the Byzantine Empire. And as I mentioned, all the exhibitions included works from the African continent. So Northern Africa was essential to Roman and Byzantine medieval worlds. But by the medieval period, Christian African communities thrived in these regions between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. The Arabic history of the Patriarchs of Alexandria, for example, describes the See of St. Mark in Alexandria as the church encompassing regions on the continent now known as Africa. Compiled by the 10th century Coptic historian, this text presents centuries of histories of the Egyptian church through the lens of its patriarchs. And it states, "And because the good shepherd, Abba Joseph, took so much care of his sheep and gave his life for them, he appointed many bishops and sent them to all the places under the See of St. Mark, the evangelist, which included Africa, the 5 cities, Al-Quran, Tripoli, the land of Egypt, Abyssinia, and Nubia." So these Christian communities, literary, visual, and material culture, have received increased attention in academic scholarship, Byzantine academic scholarship in museums for the past 30 years. While Northern and Eastern African art was featured in Byzantine exhibitions, other exhibitions of specific Christian African regions were also organized. So for example, I want us to go back to the 1990s, right after the groundbreaking African Zion exhibition toured the United States. So it opened in 1993 at the Walters Gallery Museum in Baltimore. And by the way, my colleague Christine Shaka is now organizing a spectacular exhibition about Ethiopian art that will open at the Walters in December. And so I hope we can make it to Baltimore in the fall, later fall or winter. But African Zion started at the Walters, then traveled to the Schomburg, and then the Menil Collection in Houston, the Museum of African American Life and Culture in Dallas, the Deuceable Museum of African American History in Chicago, the Chrysler Museum in Virginia, then the California African Museum in LA, and then it ended at the Cleveland Museum of Art in 1996. And I just wanted to share that because this was a really monumental time for so many fields to see the great artistic mastery of Ethiopian art at that time. But the Byzantinist, Professor Thelma K. Thomas, wrote in her review of the catalog, "African Zion has increased public visibility of historic Ethiopia after years of severely restricted access to its monuments, museums, and libraries due to dire political difficulties." Of the catalog, Professor Thomas remarked that this is a story for Western eyes, not familiar with the ancient Christian churches of Northeast Africa. The art historian, Marilyn Heldman, was a primary curator of the exhibition and wrote much of that catalog. Shortly after the exhibition, she published a focus book on Ethiopian icons titled The Marian Icons of the Painter Fry Sion. In his 1996 review of the book, the Byzantinist, Professor Robert Nelson, begins by considering the backgrounds of the various potential readers of this book on Ethiopian art. He notes that some readers might come from the perspective of considering Ethiopian art as exotic and primitive due to its flat, two-dimensional figures clothed in strong colors, especially deep blues, fire engine reds, and garish yellows. And others, quote, might be accustomed to reading about Ethiopian painting and the studies of early medieval art, where Ethiopian miniatures have been accepted as faithful copies of early Christian models. He goes on to say that still others may be inclined to view Ethiopian art in the context of African studies or to include it within a movement that he says, for better or worse, has been termed Afrocentrism. After describing all the types of people who might be interested in reading this book, he says, "Yet what's fascinating about Marilyn Heldman's book is that she actually writes about, and for, none of the above, that she gives to this art a historical specificity and cultural context that has long been denied to it. Professor Thomas and Professor Nelson's assessments were particularly perceptive and relate to the topic at hand today. After African Zion and other several important exhibitions, Ethiopian art really began to become incorporated within the study of Byzantine art. So a 10th century Arab writer also wrote about these connections between African and Byzantine culture. When he described communities near the border of Nubian kingdoms, he said, "Some of the Sudan who live nearer to these well-known kingdoms do resort to religious beliefs and practices and law, approaching in this respect the people of these kingdoms, such as the case with the Nuba and Habesha, because they are Christian, following the religious tenets of Byzantium," and the word that's used here is Rum, R-U-M. Prior to the rise of Islam, they were in neighborly contact with the Byzantine Empire because the land of the Nuba borders on Egypt, and the Habesha live on the Sea of Al-Khazum, which is the Red Sea. So Byzantine exhibitions have been increasingly analyzing this relationship between the artistic production up and down the Nile Valley, because Ethiopian and Nubian communities visited and lived in monasteries in Egypt and then throughout the Byzantine world. Byzantinists have consistently been interested in the circulations of peoples and shared visual languages in these regions. For example, my colleagues at other museums in the world have also been focused on these topics, and we've all been trained in a similar way. Both Elizabeth O'Connell and Maximilian Duran wrote dissertations about Byzantine Egyptian art, and they've both been uplifting African contributions to Byzantium, both in their permanent collection displays, but then also the special exhibitions. And one interesting fact for Max Duran, he's creating a Byzantine department, which is going to be the first Byzantine department out of any encyclopedic museum, and he's going to have sections on Ethiopia and Nubia and in Egypt as a part of his department. So I can't conclude this presentation without looking forward and giving a plug for my own work on this topic, African art and Byzantine exhibitions. As Geoff mentioned, in November, I'm opening a show at the Met on the connections between Northern and Eastern Africa and the Byzantine world. There will be about 190 objects. We have 33 lenders. And the exhibition will have mosaics, metalwork, manuscripts, wall paintings, textiles, icons, and more. But in the early development of the exhibition, I came across this quote from Toni Morrison, and I'm going to read it. "I want to draw a map, so to speak, of a critical geography, and use that map to open as much space for discovery, intellectual adventure, close exploration, as did the originating charting of the New World, without a mandate for conquest. I intend to outline an attractive, fruitful, and provocative critical project, encumbered by the dreams of subversion and rallying gestures at fortress walls." This quote has been a guiding post for my work, mainly as I've developed the exhibition project related to the relationship between medieval Africa and the Byzantine world. So as I mentioned earlier, despite being a vast empire that spanned parts of Africa, Europe, and Asia, Byzantium's extensive connections to Africa have been previously understudied and under-recognized within the broader public. My work has explored these connections and seeks to draw a new critical geography that shifts preconceived perceptions of Africa and Byzantium. Inherently interdisciplinary, my project weaves art, religion, literature, history, and archaeology together while surveying, and at times interrogating, the tradition of Byzantine art and culture in Africa from the 4th through the 15th centuries and beyond. So far, as I've shown in this lecture, communities across North Africa, Egypt and Sudan and Ethiopia formed new connections around distinct regional expressions of the Christian faith, and these identities were shaped by North and East Africa's visual and material culture. The upcoming show has 3 main sections, and it's focused on the late antiquity, but then a medieval period, 8th to 15th century for Bright as the Sun, and then a legacies and reflection section that goes from the 17th century to today. And I'm just going to share a few highlights of the objects and themes in the exhibition, because some of them have been in previous Met exhibitions, such as the 1977 Age of Spirituality. So the African Late Antiquity section will bring together a group of large-scale, richly colored limestones and marble mosaics from Tunisian museums. We'll also have a generous loan from the Brooklyn Museum of Late Antique North African Jewish mosaics as well. And the section will feature early Byzantine icons from the Monastery of St. Catherine's of Sinai, carved ivories from late antique Nubia, gold, amethyst, and pearl jewelry from Alexandria. Overall, the remarkable objects in the section demonstrate the wealth and the status of diverse communities between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, and give powerful expression to their values and systems of belief. The objects explore how different multi-faith cultural influences were adapted to unique regional taste, including Christian aesthetics and Greek traditions. An anchor of the exhibition is an Egyptian tapestry depicting Artemis and Actaeon, a theme from Ovid Metamorphoses, that would join other late antique textiles depicting Black figures drawn from Greco-Roman mythologies. In addition to highlighting issues of race, these works help explore the legacy of the classical past in the arts of late antique Africa. The second part of the exhibition reveals the ways in which Northern and Eastern African artists use imagery to interact with different identities, such as continued development and expansion of distinctive local forms of Christianity and Christian art in the region. The anchor of this section would be monumental medieval Nubian wall paintings. They look small here, but they're about 8 feet tall, and they're just really fantastic. Medieval Nubians moved in multiple cultural worlds. In addition to their indigenous language, many elites were fluent in Greek, Coptic, and later Arabic. Nubian material and visual culture was equally complex. So the exhibition will feature representations of Nubian bishops and dignitaries from the great cathedral of Firas, which is currently submerged in the Nile. And we'll also have Hellenistic metalwork and really beautiful wood and ivory boxes, such as this one. The other highlights would be rarely seen loans from the Monastery of St. Catherine's, exceptional Coptic manuscripts and icons, Ethiopian icons as well, and the section overall reflects on systems of periodization and explores the questions, where and when does Byzantium end? The exhibition will also showcase art that represents medieval Ethiopian engagement with foreign Christian religious imports, such as icons from the Mediterranean and Western Europe. For example, we'll show this Marian triptych from the Smithsonian National Museum of African Art, which depicts the theme of a nursing Mary, which originates in Egypt, that then spread across the Mediterranean and down the Nile. The final section addresses Byzantium's continued legacy in Africa and explores the ways in which artists of African descent continue to find inspiration in Roman and Byzantine traditions. The retranslations and memories of Byzantine art continue to resonate from the medieval period to today. This section will also feature contemporary artworks that reflect on and connect to earlier traditions, and so we'll have contemporary artists such as Sade Makonnen and Teo Shetu. And those works really connect to almost all of the artworks that the visitor will see previously in the exhibition, because these artists challenge how historical and environmental changes complicate the interpretation of medieval arts and architecture in the region. So above all, the project intends to challenge the conventional understanding of the separateness of Byzantium and Africa, and to also launch a new generation of scholarship on the intertwined worlds of Byzantine and African art. So I know I've been focused on meta exhibitions, and I feel a little bit sheepish about doing it here at Brooklyn Museum of Art, but so I wanted to also say that similar artworks came to the Brooklyn Museum for your African Antiquity exhibition in 1977, the same date as Age of Spirituality. And in that catalog, Sudan's connection to the Byzantine world were also highlighted. These 3 pieces were here in 1997, and these stories I've been talking about was featured then. So these are not new ideas. At the beginning of the lecture, I promised to reflect on why the public and even scholars or curators are not more aware of how Byzantine studies have incorporated Northern African art in our field. This casualty is a result of the way in which people generally consider the Christian art of Northern Africa as, quote, not African, unquote. We can discuss this topic more after the presentations, but it's been a point I've been grappling with in my work as well, wrote my dissertation on Coptic manuscripts, and it was really within a Byzantine perspective. And when I was finishing my dissertation, to my advisor, well, I want to write a chapter on the African context of these Coptic manuscripts. And she told me, well, you just need to finish your dissertation and follow those questions later. And so that's something that I'm doing now. I hope that curators and museums continue to propose exhibitions incorporating African and Byzantine art and breaking down the disciplinary silos, preventing the two fields from collaborating. I want us to continue to draw new critical geographies, push art historical boundaries, and excavate histories and narratives buried by previous generations of scholars and curators. I'm optimistic about this future, and I look forward to continuing this work. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrea. That was great and very exciting to be able to look forward to your show. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Solange Ashby. Solange received her PhD in Egyptology from the University of Chicago. Her expertise in sacred ancient languages, including Egyptian hieroglyphs, Demotic, and Meroitic, underpins her research into the history of religious transformations in Northeast Africa. Her book, Calling Out to Isis, The Enduring Nubian Presence at Philae, explores the Temple of Philae as a Nubian sacred site, and I highly recommend it. It's a little editorialism. Her second book explores the lives of 5 Nubian women from history, including queens, priestesses, and mothers. Dr. Ashby is an assistant professor in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures at UCLA, where she teaches Egyptology and Nubian studies. And I don't have the title of your paper here, but Treasures of Nubia? Hidden Treasures of Nubia will be the title of Solange's talk. So that's okay.
All right, thank you. Welcome, everyone. I want to just start off by expressing my appreciation to Drew and Anissa for organizing this amazing symposium, and really specifically for including African antiquity in the program. It's often left out when we're talking about anything about Africa, and antiquity is very much a part of African history. So Andrea has set up my talk nicely by including Nubia in the Byzantine period. I will be talking about an earlier period stretching from 3000 BCE to about 300 CE, but focusing really specifically on the region of Nubia. So there is my title, Hidden Treasures of Nubia. And for this lecture, I'm going to focus specifically on a recent exhibition put on by Boston's Museum of Fine Arts just before the pandemic shut everything down. And so I'm going to focus in on this exhibit because they have grappled really deftly with the issues of colonialism in the collecting of Nubian art, and the secondary issues of colonialism within the field of Egyptology when it comes to looking at Nubia's ancient history. I spent some time interviewing the 2 curators for this exhibition, Rita Freed and Denise Doxey, and so I'm pulling out a couple of quotes from them. I should start by saying that the exhibition drew mainly from the Metropolitan period, from about the 9th century to the 3rd century BCE, and then the subsequent Nubian kingdom of Meroe from about 300 BCE to about 300 CE. So this exhibition was staged in Boston, very intentionally reaching out to community members in the larger Boston area, and very specifically a sizable Nubian community that lives in the Boston region. Rita Freed tells me that the exhibition ran for 12 weeks and about 140,000 people visited the exhibition, including 3,000 local school children who came with their classes. Additionally, and very importantly, more than 100 Nubian community members arrived in several groups, including the Sudanese ambassador to Canada, who came down from Ottawa with a dozen colleagues. And this shows the power and resonance of these ancient objects for their descendant communities who, as a result of the flooding of Nubia after the building of the Aswan High Dam, were forced into diaspora, either within Egypt and Sudan or further afield, including many communities here in the United States. But the fascination with Nubia is not limited only to American audiences. This show then went on to travel to several other museums. And Rita Freed again says, quote, most recently in December 2018 to May 2019, more than 300 Nubian objects from the Museum of Fine Art were featured at the Drents Museum in Assen, Netherlands, where approximately 70,000 visitors, nearly twice the population of the city, visited the exhibition, end quote. So the appeal of these objects is very widespread, something that will become important as I continue on in this lecture. But first of all, where is Nubia? It is the name of an ancient land that is today located in southern Egypt and northern Sudan. In antiquity, it was called Kush. We have it referred to as such in ancient Egyptian texts, and Nubian writers who are writing in the Egyptian language also refer to their land as Kush. It is centered along the middle Nile Valley with three historical capital cities, the oldest being Kerma at the third cataract, followed by Napata at the fourth cataract, and then Meroe a little bit south of the sixth cataract. So you can see these capital cities were moving further and further south into the middle Nile region. So the reason why the Museum of Fine Arts was able to stage this fabulous exhibition is because they have the best collection of Nubian antiquities outside of Khartoum, Sudan. And there are historic reasons for that, namely the archaeological work of one George Andrew Reisner, who started off as earning his PhD in Semitic philology from Harvard University. But during a period when he was studying in Berlin, a real center of Egyptological research, he met prominent Egyptologists in the field and was swayed to the cause. So he started excavating in Egypt. His main area of exploration was the Giza pyramids in northern Egypt, but he also was in charge of the Archaeological Survey of Nubia from 1907 to 1909 before handing it off to other scholars, among them Douws Dunham. So Reisner excavated at Jebel Barkal, the sacred site at that capital city of Napata. He excavated at the oldest Nubian capital city of Kerma, and also at Meroe. So he excavated the three major capital cities of Nubia. And during this period, Egypt itself was under British colonial rule. Sudan was under joint British and Egyptian colonial rule, and because of this colonial context, we had this practice called partage, in which all of the artifacts that were excavated by exclusively foreign missions were divided between the local government in Egypt or Sudan. Half would go to the local government, being the colonial rulers in charge there, and the other half would go to the foreign missions excavating. So under this practice of partage, incredible artifacts of Nubian history were brought to Boston, also to the Penn Museum in Philadelphia, and then later to Chicago, formerly Oriental Institute, now the Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures. So the Museum of Fine Arts collaborated with Harvard University in storing and displaying this rich abundance of Nubian artifacts. And so the other thing that is relevant here in terms of the colonial history is that, as it used to be known, the Department of Antiquities, which was founded in 1859, was originally under the leadership of Auguste Mariette, and very much under French control, and in fact did not have an Egyptian serving as the head of antiquities until 1953, which not coincidentally is 1 year after the Egyptian Revolution and independence from England. So in response to symposium organizers' call to discuss, quote, the dynamic socio-political and economic context in which collected and exhibited objects are made and circulated, end quote, I would say that the lack of deep wealth in the African and African diasporic communities, not to mention the specific descendant Nubian communities, prevents museum space from being designated solely for the display of Nubian artifacts. In the way, for example, sculpture and artifacts from Greek and Roman antiquity find major donors to fund exhibition spaces. This lack of equity in action, wherein wealthy descendant communities fund the exhibition of their cultural patrimony, while those of other cultural heritages are left unexhibited and therefore unknown to the larger public, is a problem. Symposium organizers asked, quote, what does it mean to adopt a material culture approach to the study of the exhibition of African and Black diaspora art and material culture in Western institutions, end quote. In ancient Nubia, which did not practice writing to the extent of its northern neighbor in Egypt, material culture is vital to the understanding of royal iconography, religious beliefs, adoption and modification of Egyptian gods and goddesses, as well as veneration of indigenous Kushite deities. All of this rich cultural information can be understood through a deep interaction with Nubian material culture and in conversation with descendant Nubian communities. And so I show here some of the amazing artifacts, many of them made of gold, which Nubia was the source of much of Egypt's wealth in gold. These objects were on display in the exhibition, Ancient Nubia Now. And although they didn't have a dedicated catalog for this exhibition, this Arts of Ancient Nubia that I'm showing on the screen gives a really good synopsis of the types of artifacts that are available at Boston's Museum of Fine Arts. One thing that this exhibition did really well is engage with the local community, as I've mentioned earlier. So this was really highly prioritized in the planning for the exhibition. And it was Rita Freed who took the lead in making connections with the surrounding community in the greater Boston metro region. I should say that she is now retired, but was at that time a senior MFA curator, chair of the Department of Ancient Egyptian, Nubian, and Near Eastern Art, a position that she now holds as emerita. So again, Rita Freed reminiscing about how Ancient Nubia Now exhibit came about and how community engagement was vital to this exhibition. I'm quoting her. The objects and their displays were beautiful, but crowds gathered and remained longest in front of the videos discussing the relevance of the objects. Tripled the number of visitors than usual showed up for museum member tours, suggesting that people were intrigued and eager to be guided through a topic about which they knew little. Casual observation hinted that the audience was more diverse in terms of age, race, and ethnicity than most others at the MFA, end quote. So I'm just showing here two scenes. There's myself and a UCLA graduate student in Harvard Square standing in front of the bus sign for the bus that is heading to the newly named Nubia Square in Boston, alluding to that large Nubian diasporic community in the area. And also a still from one of the, I think it was 5 or 6 videos associated with the exhibition in which a young Sudanese American woman talked about her connection to the objects and how it allowed her to have a greater sense of herself as a Nubian woman. I would also like to talk a bit about the importance of ancient Nubia in the African American context. This quote is taken from a fellow at Harvard's Hutchins Center. He is a contemporary musician, a hip hop artist, but he's reflecting on the history of ancient Nubia. So I'll read out this long quote to you. What's always been clear to me is that Nubia in the African American imagination has typically represented an almost primeval, essential form of Blackness, an undisturbed kind, if you will, distinctly apart from the turbulent variety Africans endured while being transformed into chattel. I think this notion is a mix of history, myth, revisionism, poetry, and other elements. But in short, when a woman describes her hair or features as Nubian, she's alluding to a form of Blackness past which one cannot go, the limit, so to speak, all of which makes this corpus, apart from its factual archaeological basis, a rather dynamic one with which to engage. So now I will highlight a bit the videos. It looks like 5 distinct videos that were running on a continuous loop and placed throughout the gallery as part of the exhibition. So first, a video in which Chester Higgins Jr., a photographer, talks about shooting scenes in the Nile almost as if taking individual portraits of sites that he visited. And his imagery stretches from the Ethiopian highlands down the Nile to the Mediterranean, a really rich resource. The next is Nicole J. Aljo, Director of Africana Studies at Northeastern University. In her video, she discusses the centering of ancient Nubia in the writing of Pauline Hopkins, author of One Blood, The Hidden Self. Pauline Hopkins was a Black American writer from the early 20th century who did many things, including writing some sort of proto-Wakanda type fiction, including ancient Nubia. Shomarka Keita, a medical doctor and Smithsonian-affiliated scholar, discusses the concept of race as it applies to Egyptian and Nubian antiquity. Lena Bashir, who I also showed in the previous slide, a young Sudanese-American student, connects to the ancient artifacts of her Nubian culture, while Vanessa Davies discusses the history of the removal of ancient Egypt from Africa in order to make the achievements of Egypt into a precursor of quote-unquote Western civilization. And it was these videos that Rita Fried was talking about, visitors really engaging with and wanting to know more about this little-known ancient culture. So after the Ancient Nubia Now exhibition closed at the MFA in Boston, very intentionally closing on January 20th, Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, a pared down version of the exhibition then traveled to several places around the country, and I've listed those museums and their dates at the bottom of this slide: St. Louis Art Museum, then onto the Getty Villa, and the High Art Museum in Atlanta. These are some of the artifacts, beautiful golden artifacts that were on exhibit at the Getty Villa. It's all, not all, but two of them are beautiful Meroitic artifacts, the necklace and the large earring, and then that beautiful collar is from the earlier Napatan period. And I went out to give a lecture there about Nubian women, and so there, my cousin and I, being so happy to be at the Getty Villa and see all of this amazing jewelry. Oh, I should say that all of those associated lectures for the Getty Villa exhibition are available on YouTube, and one of them was done by Geoff Emberling as well, and several other scholars, including my friend and colleague Deborah Hurd. So that's a good resource to look at. Because we are here at the Brooklyn Museum, I do want to, as Andrea did, look back on this earliest exhibition of Nubian artifacts from 1977, and I'm just going to highlight the published volumes. There are actually two published in 1979. First volume of essays, and then volume 2 is a full catalog of each of the objects that were on display here almost 45 years ago. And I just find it wonderful that you can still access these exhibition catalogs online, Amazon, or wherever you buy books. They're available for $20, and a lot of this information is still pertinent and interesting today. So those objects that were on display include things like the Meroitic Queen Amani Shaketo's jewelry, stone-carved ba birds that are birds with a human head to represent the soul of the deceased, stone sculptures of Kushite kings and gods, silver crowns from the late Balana period, 3rd to the 5th century CE, and photographs of 19th century European explorers and early archaeologists who worked in Nubia. So I want to note that the major collections of Nubian artifacts in the United States are held, as I've emphasized, at Boston's Museum of Fine Arts, also at Chicago's Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures, as well as Philadelphia's Penn Museums. Currently, only Chicago still has Nubian artifacts on display, any sizable number of Nubian artifacts on display, and so I really do want to make a call for museums to take those hidden treasures out of basement storage and bring them on to display so that Nubia can take its rightful place in this long history of the African continent. This is just a floor plan of what the Nubian Gallery looks like at Chicago. Good news, sorry, I forgot to say this. They have amazing Nubian artifacts, including a very ancient incense burner from Castul, and also these beautiful bits of Nubian or pieces of Nubian ceramics, this particular one from that late Balana culture. Good news, I hope, that the Penn Museum is in the process of renovating their galleries with a big infusion of cash, and will dedicate space to ancient Egypt and Nubia. So I'm hoping all of those items that I saw stashed away in the basements some of them will find their way to the gallery floors. So I just want to wrap up by thanking both Denise Doxey and Rita Freed for taking the time to answer my questions about their Ancient Nubia Now exhibition, and as always to give a shout out to my William Leo Hansberry Society members, some of whom are in the room with us today. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, so let's talk. Don't these chairs look comfy? You can come up after and sit on them. So we have plenty of time for conversation. Thank you both for very interesting presentations. And I'm going to start. That's kind of my job, to start the conversation. And I have a sort of a two-part question, and I want to ask Andrea first. So in 1999, Stephen Weil wrote an article that's well known and maybe not super popular among curators who populate the majority of this audience. But anyway, he argued that museums need to move from being about something to being for somebody. And this is partly about an effort to, frankly, decenter curatorial authority in the development of exhibits. That's the part that's not that popular, among curators anyway. But it raises the question, who are these exhibits for? So first I want to ask you about who are these Byzantine exhibits for? This is partly a question about heritage, but it's also more broadly a question about who engages with them.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I've been reflecting on this as I do the Africa Byzantium exhibition, because so I'm going to start backwards for what my exhibition's for, and then go to who the previous exhibitions were for. My exhibition is really for New Yorkers, tri-state area people, but then also the source communities related to my exhibition. So North Africans and Egyptians and Sudanese and Ethiopians. Within the development of my exhibition, I've created a community advisory group, and I've gone through the narrative of the exhibition, the checklist, and this group is not only in the United States, but it's a lot of colleagues from the continent. And I asked that question early on, like, what do you want from this exhibition? What types of stories and narratives do you want me to uplift in the exhibition? So from the very start of this project, it's really been for those specific communities, and then also thinking about the ways in which we can engage with the academic communities and the museums communities overall. For the Met, people come to the Met, right? And if you ask like our press people who, as a Met audience, someone would say someone who reads the New Yorker or the New York Times, and that's really the Met audience. And so I didn't make this exhibition for the people who usually just walk into the doors of the Met. I made the exhibition for specific communities. When they come into my exhibition and they see these works of art, they know that this is a part of their cultural heritage. And then I'm hoping that there's going to be ripple effects and other people will connect to it. We'll see if this strategy is an effective one, but even if it's not well received by people who read the New Yorker and New York Times, I think that it'll still be a successful exhibition if Nubians and Sudanese and North African Christians and Tunisians walk into the space and feel like, okay, well, this is for me. Previous Byzantine exhibitions have also been for different people of cultural heritage. So the Greek community is really connected to the Byzantine exhibitions at the Met, so much so that they've funded exhibitions, and they've been really great supporters of my own work because I'm also showing Greek cultural heritage in the Mediterranean world. The 1997 exhibition, Gloria Byzantium, and then 2004 exhibition, Byzantium, Faith and Power, really showed the Greek diaspora what their cultural heritage was after classical antiquity. And it's interesting because I think within all of our fields, there's a sense that people can't work on their own heritage, right? And so like we see this in different indigenous fields, but then also in Byzantine studies. So there's a sense that the best scholars aren't necessarily Greek scholars. And one thing that the exhibition did was show that, well, that's not true. Like Greek scholars can work on their own cultural heritage, and the exhibition books really uplifted a lot of Greek scholars. And that's something that I'm trying to do with the African Byzantium publication. I have 40 contributors on the publication, and most of them are PhDs from Tunisia, Egypt, and Sudan, because I'm trying to follow that model that my the previous Byzantine curator did for specifically Greece and Greek cultural heritage, but for this broader area.
Yeah, thanks. That's great. So Solange, I want to spin this a little bit since you talked so much about the audiences for ancient Nubia now. I don't know if you've noticed this, but very often in the public imagination about Nubia, we have words like forgotten or hidden or lost or whatever. And I wonder if I have sort of some inklings of why that is, and I'm wondering what your thoughts about that are, because this connects. We've had now. You talked about the Brooklyn exhibit. There was also a major traveling exhibit from Penn in the 80s and early 90s, and so there's innumerable television documentaries about archaeological field projects in Nubia, and of course the Aswan High Dam, which we haven't actually mentioned, but that was a big source of a lot of these things. So there's been ample opportunity for Nubia to get lodged in the public imagination, and yet it's not. What do you think? Do you have any thoughts about why that is?
Yeah, I think there are several reasons for that. As you for sure know, but I will share with the audience that studying ancient Nubia has always been subsidiary to studying ancient Egypt, right? So it is sort of understood as a bastardized version of ancient Egyptian culture has actually been written in the scholarship. And so just seen as a lesser neglected sibling or neighbor of the ancient Egyptian culture. So that is certainly part of the reason. As it stands now, I don't believe that you can go and get a PhD, for example, specifically in studying ancient Nubia. I'm trained as an Egyptologist and then had to sort of self-train to write about Nubia. So that's one reason, one facet. But then also the fact, as you mentioned, the Aswan High Dam just drowned Nubia. And so the people are dislocated from their traditional lands. That dislocation has meant a disconnection in many senses from the culture. And so the language now is getting lost, a very ancient language. So there are many reasons. And then when I have been at various museums, and I'm not going to really name names, but I'm trying to say, please let me help you at least give the history for an exhibit that you might stage about Nubia. I'm told, A, that there's not the funding or space to put these objects on display, and that there's no interest from the public because the public doesn't know about Nubia. So there's a lot of reasons why Nubian history can be called forgotten or hidden.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think it's structural racism.
Okay,
That
you're just
is-
going to call it what it is.
Well, I mean,
Okay.
I mean, in this, and I mean this in a specific sense. I haven't written about this, but I've thought about it, so it's kind of a trial balloon. But there's this whole argument about whether Egypt is in Africa, and the reasons that is an argument is that Egypt was being appropriated for this narrative of the rise of civilization, which we all is taught in every American elementary school, and it seems unexceptional. But actually, it's racist because it creates conditions of inclusion and exclusion, and the line between them is between Egypt and Nubia. So Egypt is a part of the rise of civilization. It's a part of what made Euro-American civilization, and so that's why there are departments of Egyptology. Nubia, on the other hand, there's nothing for us to connect to that has that level of kind of cultural imaginative resonance. And so I think part of the challenge for all of us who are working in this field is to find those resonances. We have to build new ones, not continue to rely on those. Yeah.
So I just want to emphasize what I mentioned during the lecture, that Vanessa Davies, who is here with us today, did that video as part of the Ancient Nubia Now exhibition, and is very much active with the Nile Valley Collective in pushing back against these types of narratives. So there is sort of this underground movement of affiliated scholars who are trying to take up the cause of Nubia as part of world history and human cultural development that is very explicitly located in Africa, while also reasserting and asserting that Egypt, too, is located in Africa and part of African cultural history.
Can I just add one more thing to
Please,
that?
yeah.
I'm optimistic about the future, though, because we see so many more PhD students studying these things.
Yes.
When I was working on my PhD, I was the only Black person in my field. But I look at the IFA now, and there's so many other graduate students working on Nubia, working on Egypt, or even Byzantine studies of Northern Africa. And so we should also kind of think about the future and the ripple effects of these exhibitions and the scholarship in this work. But then also kind of thinking about Sudan right now. So, for example, I wanted to borrow from Sudan. I was just in Khartoum in December, and I was thinking about sustainable partnerships I could have with the Khartoum Museum there. And then, there's a civil war right now, and I really tried my best to try to bring those loans to the Met. And the director of the National Museum in Khartoum really wanted to see that happen, because they wanted to see the cultural heritage in New York. And it was the State Department that told me that I couldn't bring it. Like everything else, we had like the shippers, we had the funding, we had crates ready to go, and a whole plan, the airplanes, and the State Department said that we don't know if we could return those objects. And a part of any kind of loan agreement, you have to promise that you can return the objects. But because of the Civil War, we couldn't promise that we could return them on a certain date. So I do think that a lot of curators and institutions are trying to uplift these stories, but it's difficult to do it when you don't have some of the objects. And for MFA and Penn, that's different, but I think there's so many curators and Byzantinists who want to tell these stories, but an exhibition in a permanent gallery is not a book, right? And in order to tell a full story, sometimes you need all those objects in order to tell the stories. And so, I've been reflecting about your critiques about museums not showing some of the things that they have in the storerooms, but you also have to, it's not only the money and the finances and the interest, but then also being able to tell like a complete story as well. And so, but I'm optimistic that things are changing, and conversations like these are going to make more people know about these cultural histories that were quote unquote hidden. And so I'm just looking forward to this conversation 15 years from now, looking back and to see where we went to.
Yeah, I'm about to open it up to all of you, so get ready. But I think this claim, we have to call the Museum of Fine Arts out for having the major collection, having gathered it, having excavated it, and now having it in their storerooms. And very specifically, I want to call out the administration of the museum. This is not a curatorial problem. The curators would love to have this material on display. This is a problem of the administration, who claims, among other things, that there's not enough interest in this material. And I think as a part of the project of decolonizing museums, which we are all engaged in one way or another, you have to be suspicious of that interest. Where does your interest in something come from? And a lot of the interests that animate the kind of work that we do really ultimately is colonial. It's the idea that, yes, we are empowered to explore in Africa, whereas the reverse is not always true. So anyway, I just wanted to end this portion with that, and love to take any questions, comments from the audience. I don't know, there's a microphone. I have plenty more to talk about, but I'd rather hear from you.
Me?
Okay, yeah.
Okay. Hi. So I was interested because you were saying that the problem of kind of moving objects because of the war right now. I was wondering, how could we expand the role of the museum when there aren't objects, since we already have some here, or there's some in the UK, or kind of expand the role of museums in society, in culture, without needing those objects on display?
Yeah, do you mind repeating the question? I couldn't hear.
Yeah, you're speaking particularly about Sudan at the moment, or just it's a more general question?
I mean, I studied the case study of Sudan, but I'm more interested in starting with Sudan and then expanding to generally the role of museums and decolonizing the museum without needing objects.
How can museums take a bigger role in decolonizing societies?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great question, and it's something that I've been thinking about since, like during 2020, we've had this call to decolonize museums, and I've sometimes pushed back on the use of decolonization and context for Byzantine material and my material versus indigenous context and Native American material, just for the fact that I think that we are using sometimes decolonization in kind of a flippant way. And what I'm really interested in, and I'm just talking about Byzantium and my own specialty, is that I'm interested in uplifting the true stories that haven't been hidden, right, and not uplifted within art historical and museum studies. And I don't necessarily think that that's a decolonization method. I think that it's just a deep art historical method showing true stories that people don't know about. I think in terms of using the word decolonize, it should be for a very specific colonial context. And so that's, in my own work, I've written about this actually, that we should kind of push back about kind of flippantly calling everything in terms of bringing like African art into Byzantine galleries or Black art into medieval galleries as a decolonization project, because that's not necessarily what it is. What it is a project that's showing the real communities during this historical time period that migrated and were connected with these regions.
So I can answer a little bit more about this specifically in Sudan. And the Khartoum Museum, unfortunately, I really worry about what's going to happen there, because it's in the area that's controlled by this militia right now, and there's no international observation. No Sudanese archaeologists are able to access the museum, and we could easily wake up one day to find that the militia has looted that museum, just like they have been looting houses throughout Khartoum. It's a potential huge disaster. But at the same time, there have been, along this line of decolonization, this is maybe a bigger conversation among archaeologists who are working in Sudan, and one branch of that has to do with engaging communities through archaeology and through community museums. So even in the midst of all of this fighting in Darfur and so on, there's just been a call put out to re-engage these community museums as a way to connect Sudanese communities with their living traditions, but also with their more ancient cultures. And those regional museums are museums that basically don't have objects, and so they're constructed by the communities. And so there are ways of doing this without relying on these kinds of ancient collections. And even in wartime, So I direct an archaeological project at Napata, at Jebel Barkal, which is one of the capital cities of Nubia that Solange mentioned. And so we had planned to go back into the field. We can't do that, but because we've been working in a decolonial way where we have equal partners among our Sudanese colleagues and the communities that we work in, we're able to continue a lot of our work, particularly in the area of site protection and community engagement now. We just have to find a way to get the money to Sudan, which is not that straightforward. But I can't tell you about it, or I'll have to kill you all. But anyway, so even in times like this of active conflict, there's a potential for the kinds of histories that we've been discussing here to serve people in multiple ways, meaning, money. And so on. So there, I saw some other hands here. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Favor, and I wanted to start by saying that I think it's really sad when curators are, making effort in presenting history and addressing issues, and somehow you get like resistance from government, from people, from administrators, people who are meant to aid the work that's been done by curators. And I think we need to come to the point to where we start, understanding the tangibility of presenting historical stories, not just stories, but like exhibitions that like really historical, like this one. But like people, like you said, people need to be able to see the tangible stuff. People need to be able to, there's just a way people can relate, with something that is really tangible and not just like oral presentation and anyway. But I was going to say that perhaps there could be a way where, because of these challenges, we can come to a point where we maximize technology in such a way where we can present exhibitions in digital format, like presenting the actual works in digital format, and people can also be able to see. If the works can get over, maybe, there could be like a way the works can be recorded over there, presented in like, a digital format for people. Because I think at the end of the day, we might get to that point where restrictions here and there won't allow, works to be physically transported. And also because of, different things that could happen along the way. So maybe there's just a way we can relate with, having this cross-border interactions, but more in a digital way than the physical or tangible, but not, undermining the effect of having, the tangible works on display. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I'm just trying to thank you for all those comments. There's a lot in there to unpack. And maybe we could just talk about the digital portion of it. Would the Met entertain the idea of, instead of displaying Nubian frescoes from Khartoum, photos of them as a part of an exhibit?
That's what, so in the exhibition, we're going to have a 3D reconstruction of Firas Cathedral, and the reconstruction includes the entire Firas Cathedral. So this cathedral is a 12th century cathedral from Sudan, and it was completely painted in these beautiful wall paintings, and it rivals any Byzantine cathedral that you might have read about in your art history books, and in it's a basilica form. And you talked about the partage agreement. So during the building of the Aswan Dam, the Polish team that was archaeologists there did a partage between the Sudan Khartoum National Museum and their institutions, and basically divided up the wall paintings. And so if you think about this cathedral that's huge, right, almost like Hagia Sophia, it was basically split in half, with half of the material going to Poland and half in the National Museum in Khartoum. one thing that was really important for me for this exhibition was to put that material back together. And so that's the reason why I tried to work so hard to bring the wall paintings to New York. So, our plan B is we have this 3D reconstruction. We also do have some photography of the cathedral. And then we are trying to also bring colleagues from Sudan to New York for curatorial training, because another thing that's been important for me is not only thinking about this exhibition as a 3-month exhibition in New York and then going to Cleveland, but the long-term partnerships and relationships between the Met and our colleagues in Sudan. Because I think a lot of times, and I think this is what some people were pointing at, exhibitions can be very extractive. Right, we get the objects and we send them back, and then the conversation's kind of over. We move on to the next project. And I'm not looking at this exhibition as that. I'm looking at this exhibition as a start of a conversation between the colleagues, and not only in Sudan, but then the other regions. And so it's not only about these objects, it's the people behind these objects and the ways in which the people see this as a part of their identity.
Well, that's great. It's a good way to think about it, I think. Solange, do you have anything to add about digital? No? Okay. Any other questions? I think I've seen hands over here, down in front, and yeah?
Here, I'll start here and work my way
It's
around.
hard for us to see up here a little bit.
So thank you both very much for your fascinating papers. I'm curious about how you feel about, or if you think about, locating your work within the field of African art history. As an Africanist art historian, kind of classically trained, North Africa and the Mediterranean world, we allude to it, but a lot of us were never really trained in it. So I'm just curious, how do you look at the field of African art history as something very separate from your own professional discourses? I know you mentioned the acquisition of the Ethiopian manuscript jointly at the Met. I'm just curious about your thoughts about that and how others in your profession think about that relationship. Thank you.
Okay, I'll just start and say it has been true for me for my whole career, about 20 years now, to connect to departments of African studies wherever I am. It is just a bizarre divide that we talk about antiquity in North Africa and African studies, and I think this is changing, but doesn't tend to go back earlier than the medieval period, right? And so there is this very, I think, intentional divide between the two fields. It's not unbridgeable, though, and that's why I wanted to give a shout out to the organizers of this symposium for organically bringing the two pieces together. I think that's a great model going forward, and I do see little glimmers of hope in an edited volume that I'm working on, this symposium. It's just little by little, we can knit the two pieces back together again. I'll just say in my training at University of Chicago that we were very isolated. I don't even know where the African Studies department is at Chicago or if there is one. So I was a new mother and a graduate student. I didn't have time to get out and explore, but the division between the two fields feels very intentional, very old, and very strong. And it's time to break down those barriers, because there's a lot of good conversation to happen between the two fields.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think the disciplinary divide is difficult to overcome because it's also about the training, right? And so for Northern African material, you have to either know Latin if you're doing, the northern, the western part of North Africa, or Greek for the Byzantine Egyptian and down in the Nile Valley. And, and I feel like this is kind of a circular issue because we want more PhDs in these topics so that they can teach more about this stuff. And the question will be, what department is going to decide to change the criteria for getting the PhD? It's going to be the African art departments requiring Greek and Latin to work on that material, or is it going to be the medieval departments requiring other languages African languages, so people can really do dissertations that talk about the circulations of medieval Africans or ancient Africans, because it's really difficult to do true historical research without the right languages, right? Because you need the primary source languages, and the question is, where are you going to learn them? And so I think it's hard because on one hand, we can collaborate with each other. So I've been collaborating with Elisa Lagama, who's been such a great supporter and mentor to me at the Met, and really has been helping me through a lot of my projects focusing on Northern African material. But I'm already trained in this. And so I think about the undergraduate students or the high school students who also want to do these types of projects. And when people ask me, like, well, what should I get my PhD in? I actually don't know right now, because in terms of the humanities and different departments, there's so many cuts. Different departments are cutting languages and different criteria. And so I think it's a broader question about the humanities in general right now than only, can we collaborate between African art or Byzantine art?
Yeah, I think I think the disciplinary idea of how these disciplines might shift to accommodate or bridge that gap is a longer term. That's a long-term project that it's hard to see exactly how that would go. But in the shorter term, I think collaboration is the answer. And at the University of Michigan, we have all the departments, but we have an African Studies Center, and that's a place where people from all sides of this divide who are working in Africa get together. And actually, it was my first exposure to African art history. Ray Silverman, who some of you might know, is a member of this African Studies Center, a great proponent for community engagement. And actually, this ended up being completely revolutionizing my archaeological field practice. So Ray took me to Ghana, and then Ray came to Sudan. And anyway, so I don't know that it doesn't only have to be in departments. I think that the collaboration model that you mentioned is also can be powerful. So.
I like that point a lot. In fact, I think what we're talking about is really rethinking institutions like museums and also graduate research. And maybe we need more collaborations between universities, because often where you go to graduate school often defines where you're going, how your research is going to proceed. And maybe you have an interest in working in a different area. And there needs to be a way that you can access other professionals, and it's done at the last minute usually with a PhD committee, where you might have one person on your committee at the end of the game. But it seems like we need a whole rethinking of the whole system. Yeah, education and museums.
Okay, let's do that.
Can I just speak to that
Of course,
really
yeah.
quickly? So I feel like I did something similar through my academic trajectory, that there was no option for me to do Nubian studies, so I got the next best thing, which gives me a really deep well of knowledge about the ancient languages of Egypt specifically. But then I could pivot that, and that really had to be sort of done on my own through the process of researching and writing the dissertation. But the trajectory just keeps kind of veering off from ancient Egypt while still using that deep well of knowledge about the ancient language. So I think those pivots are really good, and that's what makes for juicy, flavorful research that can be very different from what we've seen before.
I'm going to add one more thing that I had been meaning. Anissa, I told you I was gonna call you out in a nice way. So another issue is just that we tend to travel down well-worn research questions. Remember what I said about interests being really determined in interesting ways. So one of the issues is that Nubia, for sure, I know less about the Byzantine context, and maybe you could speak to this, but Nubian research is really focused on contact with Egypt and contact with the Mediterranean world. And we all acknowledge that Nubia is in Africa, but there just has not been systematic archaeological research that tries to make connections between Nubian cultures and the broader African context. And that's totally about disciplinary tradition. So Anissa's doing very interesting work in her dissertation that is trying to, it's really some of the first steps, making those connections through ceramics, and we just need more people like Anissa. So Andrea, I am curious about how, I mean, in your discussion of the exhibits, you talked about Ethiopia, obviously, is another, but are there thoughts about how, whether there were contacts outside more formal sort of church painting and that kind of thing with the rest of Africa in Byzantine studies?
Yeah, well, I'm working on an article right now, actually, about some of the contacts between Ethiopia and Nubia and Christian communities in Central Africa, because there's been excavations in Chad, for example, of churches, and there's pottery that have crosses and fishes, and there's also a lot of primary source texts in Arabic about the circulations of Christians in these regions. And I mean, if you look at the map of Sudan, right? Like you have the Darfur region, and that's basically next to Central Africa. And so the idea that these communities didn't connect with each other or talk to each other, I mean, it's false. And so I think that there's a lot of research. I mean, and I'm not the only person who's doing this. There's a colleague who's a religious studies scholar. His name is Vince Bantu, and he's really deeply engaged with Ethiopic texts, Arabic texts, Coptic texts, and he's also doing research on these circulations and macro-regional histories of medieval Africans overall. And so you see this in medieval studies. Kathleen Bezark, who's a curator at the Block Museum, did a really fantastic exhibition called Caravans of Gold, and she also talked about these connections. And so, I mean, and I guess that this is to your point in terms of these collaborations, but because Kathleen's exhibition also included medievalists and then African art historians, and so you'll see through different collaboration projects some of the answers to these questions. I mean, I think we're in such an exciting time in our fields, right? And I mean, it can be a little bit scary, and I'm talking about the humanities, but I think that in the future, we're going to have the answer to these questions, and then more people are going to get their PhDs in these topics, and these regions aren't going to be hidden anymore.
So, yes, please.
Yes, I have a question about, I don't know if it was a rule, a law, a tradition, partage, that it was shared between the American expedition and the British colonizers. Provenance, so who set up that rule and what was left for communities in that place? Because when we talk about giving back with the restitution, I'm from Senegal, West Africa, so you can understand in which context I'm talking from. We see the Benin bronzes as a way to make a lot of noise, to silence us, so that we don't question the provenance of the other objects in all the museums around the world. So, and I'm from a country where we don't have Benin bronzes because we all know it's from current Nigeria. So we're looking at how the objects left the continent. And in the case of partage, I'm wondering who made that law, and are you comfortable with that? Because I know that in Europe, whether it's UK or France, when they took the object, they created a law that will prevent it from going back. So you steal me, and then you create a law so then you are not the thief. So I'm wondering the case of the partage, how it was made, who decided on it, and how come in the sharing, even if it was a British colony at the time, people in the land didn't have a say. So just for me to understand that process, because most kids in Africa don't think American museums, since they didn't colonize Africa, so it means there's no question of ethics in the collections, but maybe yes, maybe no. So just to clarify, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So I can only really talk about the Egyptian collection, which is under my purview and not anything else. But so the Met's been doing excavations since 1910, and it had excavations from 1910 to 1930s. And obviously this is within a colonial type of mindset because it was unequal power structure. But it was really the Egyptian government who facilitated the partage agreement for the Met excavations. And then for other Western institutions, you had similar partage agreements. In terms of, do I feel comfortable now because of the separation of material? You know, the Met is still working
in these regions, and every single excavation that we do, we have it's half Egyptians, a half Egyptian ministry, and half the Met. And I can't speak to maybe 1980s or 1990s, but I do know that my colleagues right now really think about sustainable partnerships and engagements and trainings. And so we always have Met fellows and curators and ministry officials work at the Met and work on that material. And so we're not only thinking about these objects that are connected to objects that are in the Egyptian Museum, for example, but then also thinking about proper training and conservation and preservation. In terms of this experience, in terms of working on these projects in Egypt, so I've been an archaeologist in Egypt since 2007, I've learned so much from my colleagues through these cross collaboration. I probably learned more from them working on this material in Egypt than they probably learned from me and our conservation colleagues. And I think that these collaborations and communications, connections are important for the development of history. So maybe that's not like the right answer that you're looking for, but I think more about the objects themselves, but then the people behind them and the people who are caretakers of these objects and those regions, because these are my friends. And they come to the Met and we talk about objects. I go to the Egyptian Museum and we think about projects in the future. So it's more than, like, are we going to send pottery back to Egypt and put them in storerooms, is how can we work together in the future? I do know that different institutions look at this issue in different ways, and but I'm a fan of the Met, if you can't tell, and I just think that we're reflecting in the past and thinking about how we can fix things that we've done in the past, but also we're looking forward to the future as well.
I would just add that it is important to acknowledge that this law of partage that was established by the Egyptian government was actually the British who were ruling in Egypt at that time. And so the division, half and half, essentially breaks down to a division between foreign expeditions coming from various European nations and the United States primarily, and then the French, who were there in control of the Department of Antiquities. And so, yes, very much as you have pointed out, there was no involvement of the local Egyptian people, much less so the local Nubian people further south in the division of their cultural heritage. And so it is a very uncomfortable fact that the objects that we have here, that we have access to, and that sometimes are on display were brought here. It might have been legally, but it's not exactly all right. There's a huge problem in the way that partage was.
Say that it's not true that Egyptians weren't involved in this. And actually, I mean, for the partage agreement was the government, but then you also had the art market that was happening at the same time. And a lot of those dealers were Egyptian dealers. Like there's this dealer, his name is Mohammed Mahasib, and a lot of the late antique and early Christian material is from that dealer, and he lived in Luxor. And he was, I mean, if we're talking about potentially like illegal excavations, it was through a lot of, I mean, you're giving me a look.
I'm not. No. It's a contested issue. Yeah.
There's more than.
This is a little bit of a flamethrower right at the end of our panel.
No. Just to make it clear, I was just talking about partage because if we go and do the entire history, we need a year. Mm-hmm. But I just wanted to understand that partage deal. So, in one word, it was legal, but absolutely not ethical.
It was the colonial administration for sure. But that's during the Aswan Dam, for example, after independence in Egypt, there was also a partage agreement. It was as part of an incentive to get foreign projects to work in salvaging Nubian antiquities. So anything that came out as a part of the Aswan Dam salvage, like for example, almost all of the collection at the University of Chicago, the Nubian collection, is not subject to that criticism. And in fact, the Sudanese government in the 2000s was doing another dam project at the Fourth Cataract, and they also issued an offer of partage, an equal division of fines. So it's a complex history, and it's not all colonial. And I think you could argue it's not all bad and unethical. But I don't know. We had Peter. Do you want to just say something about this, or?
Yeah, I wanted to say it began the partage system because there was just widespread looting, and so this was a way for the Antiquities Service to try to make sure that archaeological objects were recovered and safely excavated. And while there was a division, it wasn't an equal division. The Cairo Museum, less so in the Sudan, but the Cairo Museum got first pick. The Narmer palettes in Cairo, it's not in Oxford. The Tutankhamun treasures are not in Highclere Castle, they're in Cairo. So one of the reasons the system was originally set up was that the Cairo Museum could build up its own collections at no expense. The foreign expeditions paid for all the expense of excavating, documenting, and shipping the material to Cairo, and then Cairo got its pick. And it started out a half share, but it gradually got less and less as time went on. So it's not all kind of bad. And again, the point was to build up documented archaeological collections rather than have looted, undocumented material in museums.
Okay, so this is just thank you, Peter. That's just a hint of the complexity of this issue. And with that, I'm going to have to close this session. Thank you all for your attention and questions. And we will...
Excuse me, sorry.